After completing this lesson, you'll be able to insert a mesh of the residual limb and position it correctly on the canvas. You'll be able to use the sculpt tools to create a cylinder to wrap around the mesh, and use the freeform modelling tools to refine the new Fusion 360 body and thicken the material. So to begin, on the toolbar, select Insert, then select Insert Mesh. Then we need to select Limb Mesh from the dataset and click Open, and that will insert the scan of the residual limb into the Fusion canvas. Now we can use the arrows to position the mesh where we want it on the canvas. Then click OK to close the dialog window, click Home for the isometric view. Now that we've got the scan in Fusion, what we want to do is create a body from the mesh. And if we go to the browser, we can see our mesh, but we can also note that we don't have any bodies yet. In order to build our prosthetic design, we need to have bodies to work with in Fusion. So click Create Form, and then in the Create menu, click Cylinder. Now select the ground plane to work on, and then select the top view using the View Cube. And from the center origin, click and drag out around the mesh. Then using the View Cube again, we need to rotate round so that we've got a right-hand view. Then using the arrow, drag the cylinder height up so it rises above the top of the mesh. And in the cylinder dialog box, we want to change the number of height faces to 6, so we can create a little bit more detail, then click OK to close the window. Zoom into the model a little. Now select Modify Edit and select these lines to pull the top of the cylinder just below the top of the mesh. And when you've done that, you can click OK to close the dialog window. And if you use the Orbit tools to move around the model, you can see the mesh inside and the cylinder surrounding it. Now we're going to wrap the new cylinder body around the residual limb mesh by going to the toolbar and clicking Modify, then Pull. And this is kind of like vacuum forming in Fusion. Now if we drag a selection window all the way around the cylinder body, Fusion will pull it onto the mesh. When you've done this, click OK to close the dialog window. Orbiting around, we can see that we need to make sure that the cylinder body extends all the way around the lower section of the mesh. To do that, first double-click the last edge of the cylinder body. This creates a loop. Then in the toolbar, select Modify, Edit, and we can now use the Sculpt Edit tools to bring the body all the way around the lower part of the residual limb mesh. By holding the Alt key down on the keyboard and dragging down the arrow, we can add more material where we need it. We can also use the freeform manipulation tools to shrink the material in like this. And we need to use the navigation tools to rotate around our model to get different views in order to get as accurate as possible to the contour of the lower part of this residual limb mesh. Using the Alt key to add material or the manipulators to shrink the material around as we go. Now at this stage, we're going to need to select individual edges in order to wrap those really snugly around the contours of the lower part of the residual limb mesh, before we finally close it off using a fill hole command. So we'll need to take our time, selecting the individual edges, and use the manipulation tools to manipulate them into the position that we want, getting as close as possible to the contours of the lower part of this mesh. Then double click the final edge of the cylinder to create a loop, select Modify, Fill Hole. In the dialog, ensure that the fill hole is a collapsed star, then click OK to close the window. Then orbit around the model, checking for any imperfections, and use the Modify Edit tools to make any final modifications to any detail that you feel necessary. So I'm just modifying some of the final edges to ensure that I have a really nice curvature which follows the original mesh as closely as possible for our new Fusion body. And when this is complete, I can click OK to close the dialog window, and then also click Finish Form. We no longer need the mesh, so if we go to the browser, go to the bodies, and switch off the visibility for the socket mesh. And if I orbit around now that I've turned off the visibility for the original mesh, we can see that we have a new Fusion body, which is completely hollow. This will be our socket mesh liner. So let's increase the thickness of our liner. To do this, we'll use the timeline. Right-click on the form feature and select Edit. Then in the toolbar, choose Modify, then click Thicken. Select the new Fusion body, and in the dialog window, enter 1 mm for thickness, then click OK. So that's increased the thickness of our new body to 1 mm. And if we go to the browser and have a look at the bodies, we can see the new body here. So let's click Finish Form, and then if we double click on the body in the browser, we can rename the body to something more relevant to our design, save the file, and this completes the lesson.